There was a documentary this week about why we should be having a debate about some of the country's greats and their monuments to our country's greats, and why we should be potentially removing them and destroying them, which is a particularly touchy subject, but something that you discuss in your book. So do you want to give us your take on this and we can have a chat about it?
Yeah. So in my book, I use as examples of the kind of warriors that we should be emulating. One of which I use is Churchill, and another one that I use is Nelson. And in this particular television programme, the presenter, who I think is called Afua Hirsch, was saying maybe we should be thinking about removing these monuments because of what she perceived as being things in their character, things that they did which weren't particularly virtuous.
Okay.
And the reason that I feel it's important to talk about it is because, for me, those kind of let's destroy the past or rewrite things, particularly fail to understand what it is to be a fighting person.
Right.
And these two national heroes in Churchill and Nelson, why is it that we would seek to emulate them? Why is it we have Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square? Why do we have a statue of Churchill? Why does Churchill continue to be voted the greatest Briton? And it is an interesting thing, and maybe thanks to her for providing material to kind of riff off and understand. But I do think it's important to state and to understand what it is to be a fighting man and what that means.
Yeah. So what were the reasons that she thinks we should be getting rid of these monuments to these awesome guys?
Well, in short, it's because race, in her case, not just race, but her contention was that because of Churchill's, if you like, failure to act during the Bengal famine in 1943, in which 3 million people died,
right,
and because of Nelson's, what she described as his support for the Atlantic slave trade, therefore, these are not people we should be emulating, or those parts of their past aren't taught or aren't well known. Which is interesting because we've got an access to knowledge now that we've never had before with the internet.
Right.
If you want to go and find out about Nelson, you want to find out about Churchill in their totality of who they were, then you can do that.
Yeah.
If you're interested. If you're interested. But then there's also a reason why there's monuments to them.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't kind of make sense to me. And I think that if there was some kind of survey put out there, I would guess that 80-90% of people would say, "Are you having a laugh?"
Well, of course. But,
Right,
but she was surprised by the vitriol and the anger that she got on social media.
She was surprised?
She was surprised.
I'm surprised she was surprised.
I'm surprised that she was surprised. And maybe that is partly on her part, a failure to understand what they mean.
Yeah.
And maybe to understand the fighting man, we can start with Nelson. Maybe talk about Churchill as we go on.
Okay.
If that's all right with you.
Go for it.
Because the thing about fighting men, and the thing about the military, is that it is the military and the force of arms of the nation that ultimately is what delivers its freedom. There is no real way around this. And as much as we might want to talk about the fact that it's kind of dissidents, journalists, writers that uphold freedom of speech, ultimately it's down to the force of arms of that nation.
Okay.
Otherwise there isn't a nation. And this is very clear, I think, with Nelson and with Churchill. And that the freedoms that we enjoy in this country, to pick one, but in any country which has freedom, has been given to them not as a right, and it seems like, it's a human right, but that it's a human right only because we have the ability to protect it. There's a great, I don't know if it's great, but there's a poem by a US Marine chaplain, which says, for instance, it's the soldier, not the journalist, that ensures freedom of speech.
Right.
And there's a couple of verses which are based around these lines. And that reflects an ultimate truth for me, is that it's only violence or the threat of violence that ensures the integrity and the continuing freedom of rights that we have in this country and in any country that has it. And then if you look into the past, even the recent past, you'll see extraordinary violence often in order to maintain that. That's one thing.
Okay.
Nelson, on the other hand, is if we try and understand who those fighting men were and who fighting men continue to be. Nelson himself is a very, very interesting character. And one of my favourite stories about Nelson is that he was from Norfolk, so he had a very strong Norfolk accent.
Right.
He was also tiny. I don't know if you've ever seen his uniforms. I mean, his chest is like that of a bird.
Really?
He's absolutely tiny. Now, I know obviously people then were generally smaller, down to nutrition and medicine and such things. But he was tiny. And, he had one eye.
Yeah.
And he had one arm.
That he lost in battle, right?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. The reason being, I mean, we see depicted with a lot of sailors of that period and pirates, for example, classic, one leg and an eye patch. Yeah. Which is generally down to shrapnel, because you fire a cannonball at an oak ship and you get the splinters. Yeah, right. And you can take a splinter in your cheek maybe and just have a scar, but you take one in the eye, that's your eye, isn't it? Yeah. And in those days, it's not like they were applying people full of antibiotics. If you got a bad shrapnel wound, bad splinter wound in your arm, and they were so worried about infection, rightly, it could kill you with gangrene, that they used to, amputate it in horrific, speedy fashion. Yeah. So you see a lot of famous sailors of that period with injuries like that, with limbs missing, with eyes missing. So he's a real fighting man in that sense. But it was said that he couldn't even get the courtesans to sleep with him, right? Because they thought he was, whatever, physically, for his status as well. It was like, was not worth their effort. But then he won the Battle of the Nile, and he came back to England as a hero. Yeah, right.
All the ladies are interested.
Exactly right. Yeah, and that always fascinates me about a little story about who he was, because it's such a human story, isn't it? It's like he couldn't even get people to sleep with him, but then the Battle of the Nile, he's a hero. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, everybody is clambering over him. But he came from. Not an aristocratic background, because the Navy has got such a strong tradition of being a meritocracy. That's not to say that he came from the streets, because to be a naval officer, you still got to be able to read and write well. And remember, this is a different time than now, when we have such a high level of literacy. I mean, he had to be from at least partly educated background. Yeah. And then they sent them away to sea very young, often 14, to be midshipmen, and then by their own efforts. To make their way up the ranks, and then they got great responsibility based on their competence. And so there's a very proud history in the Navy, and I say this as an army person, but they do have, because in the army at that time you could buy commissions, don't forget. Right. So there's a different history in the Navy, which they're rightly proud of, I think, that it's always been a meritocracy. Right. So the best guys tend to rise to the top. Nelson, you can say a lot of things about him. He was incredibly ambitious. And he's what, in army parlance, we would call a thruster. Right. Yeah. Okay.
What's a thruster?
A thruster is somebody who's always thrusting for promotion.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. And it is a kind of pejorative term in the army. It's like, but at the same time, if you're going to make, the rank of Admiral, make the rank of General in the army, it doesn't happen by accident. Yeah. It happens, yes, because of your competence, but you need to be going in that direction as well. Yeah. And if you're competent, then it's the right thing to do, because you're going to be the one in responsibility. Mm-hmm. So if you think you're the best person for it, then it's incumbent upon you to go for it. So there's Nelson as a very thrusting naval officer. Mm-hmm. In his own words, I mean, it seemed that he often bigged himself up in reports and maybe lessened the roles of other people.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So there's many things you can say about Nelson.
Yeah.
But there's also this aspect about him which is called the Nelson effect, where it seemed that through his force of personality, he made everyone feel more confident.
Okay.
They called it the Nelson effect
Right.
in his own time. So that leads me to believe he was quite a charismatic individual. For all his tininess, and he's got one arm and he's got one eye, and his thick Norfolk accent and all that, there was something that's special about him in that respect. So the key point about this is it's often not your nice guys that have these kind of abilities.
I see. Okay.
I mean, I don't know if you can think of any people you've met who are very gifted, very brilliant people. Probably not the most balanced people.
Yeah. Very kind of focused, single-minded, not necessarily kind of to everybody else's benefit, but just their own perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, with Nelson, that single-mindedness to me comes across again and again and again. And what do you need if you're going to be fighting battles like this? You need to have that pure single-mindedness. And that single-mindedness is probably also what gave other people confidence.
Yeah.
Thought this may or may not be the kind of guy that I want to hang out with and invite to a dinner party. But that is not what you need.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think that warfare is?
Yeah.
Do you think it's a game where you try and be as nice as you can to each other?
Yeah.
It's not, is it?
Yeah.
And he's facing really horrific conditions, as all the sailors did then. And the work of being a sailor, seriously hard physical work. I mean, these guys were eating upwards of 5,000 calories a day because they had to. Right. And it's not like they were fat, right? I mean, it's they're seriously hard physical graft. So these were physical men. And, are they therefore the most, what you might call civilized and on all this? No, they're not. But you need them. And you need them because if it hadn't been for Nelson's victories, then, and for which he gave his life, of course, then it may well be that the country would be invaded by France, and then you don't have that country anymore. So that's the significance of Nelson. Yeah. You expect him to be virtuous in all respects, then to me that's idiotic. He was a man who was single-minded, super competent, invented or at least adapted some incredible naval tactics, was supremely aggressive. And perhaps the reason that he was so aggressive was because in the Navy at that time they had this double incentive, a stick and carrot method. And we probably can look at that in a term and maybe sniffy terms now, but a lot of what they did was to get the prizes, was to get the money from the booty of the ships.
I see. Okay.
So as an admiral, Nelson would have got a share of all his captain's booty as well.
Okay.
And there was a key man on each ship called the prize officer.
Yep. And
And that prize officer was like a kind of civil servant, like a kind of clerk. And he would sit down and work out what each person in the ship's share of that booty was, depending on their responsibility and depending on their rank. And so if you want to know why they went so fast after those ships, it's because they knew that they would get the money. And this is a time before social services and before any kind of state support, or, you know, this was their opportunity to make some money. And many of them made a lot of money doing this. So there was a huge financial incentive where you could raise your social standing and everything else. So they had that natural aggression. You see the ship, you go for it. On the other hand, in the Navy, they also had an ordinance that said that if you failed to do your utmost when you saw the enemy, then you would be court-martialed, and which meant executed.
Okay, wow.
So you got this double thing of, you go because you want the prizes and you want the money.
Yeah.
And if you don't exploit that opportunity to attack the enemy, then you're going to get court-martialed and disgraced and all the rest of it. So you built a culture in the Navy of being supremely aggressive.
Right.
And you know, that's what made people frightened of the British Navy, is they were, you know, pugnacious beyond and aggressive beyond, you know, and that's a historical legacy that goes back to Francis Drake as well. Because he was supremely aggressive as well.
Yeah.
And again, that was because he was after the booty. I mean, there's not much difference really between piracy, being a buccaneer, being a privateer, and being, you know, a member of the Navy. You know, and because those qualities, you know, because it's not a pleasant game, is it? You know, it's not a pleasant game. You know, you're playing for very high stakes.
Yeah.
And when you need to do that, then you need people who are supremely aggressive.
Mm-hmm. There's a bit in the book I like to read that struck a chord with me. Have a look at this, and it says, this is how it always goes with fighting men. They are the heroes of the day during war, and then embarrassing reminders of violence during peace. From the comfort of our armchairs and the lifestyles they died to protect, we're able to pick apart their actions in super slow time and issue meaningless statements about what they should have done. There are scores of academics whose entire living is based on this, and that's it. We're all reaping the rewards of the things that these guys did. We can sit here from our armchairs having a little kind of our finger pointing, a finger wagging stuff, but realistically, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be living the lives that we've got in the privileged, country that we live in, if they hadn't done their thing, right?
Yeah.
So to finger wag. Slavery is kind of nobody's condoning slavery at all, but the fact is that it's history, isn't it? It's a sad fact of our history, but we are where we are.
Yeah, and to understand it in its entirety, we see it as the aberration it is. When you look at that time of Nelson, we know the result, and we assume sometimes that they knew the result of what was going to happen. They didn't.
Yeah.
There was absolutely no guarantee that Nelson would win the Battle of Trafalgar.
Yeah.
None at all. To him fighting that, you pull out all the stops to fight it.
Yeah.
Now this is a battle in Europe of dominance. It's a battle of commerce as well, because commerce and trade give you the ability to advance your military technology.
Yeah.
Not just in terms of numbers, but the naval ships, the British naval ships, they pioneered the use of having copper bottoms, which made them fast.
Right.
Because before then, you get accretions like barnacles, which slow down your vessel. So they pioneered the use of the copper. That's expensive.
Right.
So all the commercial activities of that nation are key in producing a warfighting machine.
Yeah.
And they can't be seen apart from that. Where did Britain get a lot of its money from? Slavery.
Yeah. Right.
Overseas colonies. Why did they seek to have those overseas colonies? Why did they want to build an empire? And the things that were done in the name. People say it was always all about money. Yep. Yeah, it's all about commerce. Why is it all about that? Because if you're going to exist as a nation, then you need to build that economy up in order that you can pay that army, in order that you can pay that navy, in order that you can do these technical things. But that does not mean that you then have to say, oh, well, that's okay then. You don't have to make an excuse for it. It doesn't mean that it clouds your view of the aberration of slavery. To understand it or to see it in those terms doesn't mean you've got to then say, oh, that was all right then.
Yeah.
No. But understand why they were doing those things as well. Does it excuse it? Well, it's how it was at that time.
That's it. It's of the time, isn't it? Yeah. Absolutely. So we look at everything now through a different lens, right? So it's a tough one. Is it? What about Churchill? What have we got to?
So Churchill, in some ways, he has that same single-mindedness that I think is seen in Nelson. And you got a column to Nelson. Why have you got a column to Nelson? Because there's certain aspects of it that we can symbolise and say are admirable. You have to say the whole bloke is would be exactly like him.
Yeah.
It is useful, though, I think, to know more about the complexity of the fighting man, because it's as much his flaws that we see that make him as good as he is. Right. It's as much the flaws as it is their strengths. It's not in spite of the flaws that they're as good as they are. It's partly because of them. We look at some of the lives that those people led and we say, oh, it's debauched and it's all about, rum and women and, okay, that's partly why they are so good. It's not in spite of it. And we can take elements of that. We don't have to be a Nelson. Yeah. We don't have to be a Churchill, right? Because they are rare people. But there's parts of their character, parts of what they did that we want to emulate. First of all, determination. And Churchill, for me, and the reason I got cushions in my house and mugs in my house with Churchill's face on them, is because he so well embodies that perseverance. Yeah. He's a man who made great mistakes in his life, like Gallipoli, and yet he came back from it. He went in the trenches in the First World War, partly as kind of penance for the mistake that he made with Gallipoli, right. Which is a mistake. If you're in a position of power, you can make big mistakes. Right. If you're not in a position of particular power, you'll make mistakes, but they won't be very big, will they? Because you haven't got the theatre in which to do it. Yeah. So of course Churchill made big mistakes because he was in that position that his mistakes, and you know, let's not beat around the bush, his mistakes meant a lot of people died. Yet he came back from that because he felt that he had something to offer. He said, you know, that he was willing to win the war at all costs. Now, he wasn't joking when he said that. You know, he absolutely meant it. And that quote in the book from him that I mention about if this Long Island story is it to come to an end at last, then let it end only when each of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground.
Yeah.
I mean,
There you go.
you can look at that and you can say, well, you'd be all right, you're in a bunker. But you forget this was a guy who was in the trenches in the First World War. He'd been a prisoner of war as well in an earlier period and escaped. He was a man who knew what it was to fight.
Yeah.
And I don't doubt for a second that he meant that.
Yeah.
But he's another man who's charismatic.
Yeah.
And again, you get a charismatic individual, people people can follow, feel confidence in. Probably not, you know, again, a nice person you want at a dinner party necessarily.
Yeah.
I mean, I heard somebody once say that they thought Churchill was a bit stubborn. What? Stubborn? Yeah, I think the Nazis thought that as well. They probably thought he was quite stubborn. Oh my word! You know, you've got a period in history there where we're facing an absolute existential threat.
Yeah.
And we know the result now.
Yeah.
But at the time, you know, you asked my parents about it who lived through the war. People did not know whether we were going to win it or not. You know, and you get this guy who seems to come at the right time in the right place. What you want to say he's a nice guy? Like, let's hope not. Let's hope that he has all those qualities that Churchill had.
Yeah.
Because that's what you need.
You'd take him again, wouldn't you, if we had the same sort of situation arise again? Not that it ever will, but if it did, and we could have a Churchill-esque, Churchillian, we'd take that, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is the danger that if you start to say, well, we don't want people like this because they don't seem to fit in a civilized peacetime, then when you actually need people like that, you look around and go, where the hell are these guys?
Yeah.
Because you know this is the significance of people like that.
Mm-hmm.
You know maybe not want to say what beautiful manners they had or whatever. That is not the people you need.
Yeah.
You know you need people whose failings drive them as much as their strengths.
Yeah. The story in the book about Algeria.
Mirza Kabir.
Yeah. Tell us that one.
Yeah.
Because that's a
So
fascinating.
it's funny that in that documentary, it was mentioned the Bengal famine. So the contention there is that, and they mentioned it in there as well, that although Churchill he probably couldn't have stopped anyone from dying in the Bengal famine. But what he might have been able to do is send some ships, send some relief, and actually help. But this was in 1943.
Yeah.
And again, come back to Churchill's single-mindedness.
Yeah.
You know, he was going to win the war at all costs, and he didn't want to use the ships because his effort, as far as he was concerned, was to win the war at all costs. Now, when you say at all costs, you need to understand what that means. Does that mean that you then don't go and help people who are dying of famine? Well, he's in that position to make that decision, isn't he? You know, and for most of us, we're never even in that position to have to make that call. Mm-hmm. But there's an illustration of Churchill's single-mindedness and will, which is in the Mirza Kabir, where the Germans had taken over France, and the part of the French fleet hadn't been captured yet. And he said to the French, you've got options here. You can either scuttle all the ships to deny them to the Germans, because they would have been a significant asset for the Germans to have, because of good ships, destroyers and all sorts.
Scuttle the ships, kind of sink them.
Sink them.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or you can go to a British port, and we'll take them off you. And if you don't, then we'll sink them. We'll send the RAF to sink them. These are French ships, remember. These aren't Germans.
Yeah.
These are allies. Mm. And the ultimatum passed, and that's exactly what happened. They sunk them, and 1,300 French sailors died. So, that's a hideous thing to do, right?
Yeah, but
it's a hideous decision to have to make. Mm. But there's an illustration of Churchill's single-mindedness. And there's another aspect to that, which I you put yourself in the place of the Germans for a second. When that news came in, that Churchill had deliberately ordered the sinking of his own allies to deny them the enemy advantage, I imagine some beads of cold sweat dribble down their back.
Who is this guy?
Who is this guy?
Yeah.
Who is this guy? And there's that saying that all battles are won in the will. Mm-hmm. And they thought, the willpower of this guy, that he's willing to do this.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't detract from the fact that there's 1,300 French sailors that no longer live because of that.
Yeah.
But in order to win the war, that was what Churchill was willing to do. Mm-hmm. One of the things which I think is great about, we got this here, Boris Johnson's book on Churchill, that I hadn't realised before, was that it seemed that Churchill was aware from the very beginning that the only way to win was to get the Americans involved. So he'd done his assessment of the relative combat power.
Yeah.
And so that shaped his part of his decisions was, how do we get the Americans in the war? Bearing in mind, of course, he was half American, because his mother was an American. He wasn't arrogant about the power of Britain. And by the power of Britain, I don't just mean the British, I mean the Britain and the Empire. Because again, it's something which I think needs to be illustrated, that even when they say Britain stood alone, we had the Indians in huge numbers. We had all the Commonwealth countries, we had the Kiwis, we had the Australians. And my grandfather would tell you how good those soldiers were. He spoke about the Australians, the New Zealanders, and the tremendous abilities that they had. Yeah. So it wasn't just the British alone. When we say it was the British alone, it was the Empire together. But Britain, it wasn't me, had to hold out during that period in order to not lose the war. Yeah. And get the Americans involved, and obviously the Russians got involved as well. There's a saying which I have some problems with, which is that the Second World War was won by Russian blood and American money. And the reason I've got some problems with that is because that kind of makes out that no Americans died. It's like, well, 450,000 Americans, around that sort of figure, died. So there's a lot of American blood. But then it's too simplistic really for words, but there's an element of truth in that the industrial machine of America was absolutely vital in the winning of the war. And the Russians lost nearly 9 million soldiers. I mean, most of the things that you look at from the Second World War, in terms of figures, are unbelievable. It's too staggering to the mind to get your head around what happened with the figures. Yeah. So you think of the Germans killing 6 million Jews. They killed nearly 1 million Roma people. Right. The deaths of the Japanese occupied countries are like 6 million. The numbers are so huge you don't even know what to do with them in your head. So you imagine again Churchill losing the war at that period, and we can only speculate because it's not possible to see the branch of history that wasn't taken, the results of that. What do you think the Japanese would have done? What do you think the Nazis would have done with the countries that they overtook? What do you think they would have done with Britain? What do you think they would have done by extension with the empire, as it was then? With India? What do you think the Japanese would have done moving across Asia? We can only speculate. But that's why there are statues to Churchill, because he symbolises the character, not only of himself, but of what happened in the country at that time as well. Yeah. And it underlines the fact that that those fighting spirit, those fighting people are what gives us the freedom. It sounds kind of maybe a little bit jingoistic now to say it like that, but we don't have to have personal pride necessarily in that, because we weren't there, were we? It's a bit daft me having complete personal pride. Okay, my grandfather was there. My grandfather fought in El Alamein with the Desert Rats, then went up through Italy, Monte Cassino, and we went as a little regimental trip to Monte Cassino. And bearing in mind, Iraq, Afghanistan, all those sorts of places I've been, but we looked at that terrain and we just shook our heads and went, I don't understand how they did it. I do not understand how they did it, because it's pretty staggering. But all those people collected together, it's not like, it'd be silly of me to take a personal pride in it because I didn't do it. Any more than it would be silly for me to beat myself up about things that happened in the past that I don't agree with. But there is, I think, in the monuments and in that remembrance, a kind of tradition of service and of sacrifice and of competence that we do want to carry forward.
Yeah.
We don't have to carry the whole thing forward, especially the bits that we think now are abhorrent. Don't have to. But the regimental pride, for example. So within a regiment, you go into the mess, and there's pictures of all the battles up. I didn't take part in those, so I'm not taking personal pride in it. But the reason that we have those traditions is not to have a feeling of arrogance. It's to have a benchmark by which you go, these are the standards that you're expected to uphold. And so what they do is they create an ethos which is advantageous in the present. It's, look, there is a history of this regiment. It's a proud history. Here are all the battle honours on the colours. That's your inheritance. You don't have to take personal pride for things that you didn't do. But that is the standard that this is the inheritance of this group of people who have to fight right now and here. Yeah. And they are to me, that's what tradition's for. It's to uphold certain things that you want to keep emulating and to build that ethos. Yeah. And again, if that's partly represented by Nelson's column, if it's partly represented by statues of Churchill, then that is one way of doing it, and it's a full part of our history.
Yeah, it's like deleting our history, and if you can't be moving them things, it seems the monuments aren't going anywhere, right? How much of it do you think was just kind of typical inflammatory journalism to kind of raise somebody's profile, to have a bit of a chat about something, I'll get outrage from 90% of the population? It's got to be a bit of that, right?
I mean, one of the things she did was with a guy in Bristol. He had a plaque made up about Bristol being this great slave capital of England, which it was. Mm-hmm. And they then made up this plaque and they went and stuck it on a monument. Mega. I mean, it's like, okay, what have you achieved with that? But there is a desire, I think, it feels quite sexy to be doing supposedly anarchic things. Yeah, okay. It's iconoclastic, and it's anarchic, and I feel a bit edgy when we seek to hammer away at the kind of established pillars of the status quo and all that. I kind of understand that because, we've been talking a lot about innovation, haven't we, and problem solving and coming up with new ideas. And you need to challenge the status quo to do that. Mm-hmm. So I kind of understand that a bit. But at the same time, it's easy to want to break things down like that, isn't it? And it's so easy to point a finger and say, "Oh, you're not as good as they all make out." Well, probably not, because who is? Yeah, right. And if you're in a prominent position, you're going to make big mistakes. Mm-hmm. And the more talented you are, probably, and more capable are, probably your vices are bigger too. Yeah, right. But that's part and parcel of it. Mm-hmm. And you need to look at it and say. We have a strange thing now with politicians as well, I think, in that often our most gifted politicians, again, are looked at in forensic detail morally. Yeah. Now, there's a morality when it comes to how you do your job, but there's another kind of morality as well. I mean, I'm going to put this right out here, John. If somebody is a great politician and he's doing great things for the country, does it matter if he sleeps with prostitutes? That's a question, John. I mean, it's a question. Yeah.
Morally, people will have a problem with it, right? People will have a problem with it, but...
Well, there's an argument that they say, well, people are role models, but let's hope not, because being kind of pure in virtue and being competent rarely goes together. I mean, if you want to meet somebody who's really virtuous, it's probably a hermit who doesn't do anything. Yeah. You don't need a great deal of talent to do that either. I had a funny thought. I hope this makes you laugh, but you remember when Wayne Rooney was playing really, really well? Yeah. And he was on top of his game, and he was rampaging through defences. You know what I'm going to say, don't you?
Was it because he was rampaging through grannies as well?
There's a kind of... I mean, it'd be fun to do a statistical analysis of when he was playing at his best. Yeah. But, if you're going to put up footballers as role models, right, these are guys who kick a bag of wind well. Right? Why are we looking at them as role models? We look at role models for being good at playing football. Yeah. But if you're saying to your kid, you know, oh, having to go at a footballer because he's not behaving well, which is fine. I mean, you know, I understand that. But then to say, well, he's my son's main role model. Dude, what are you doing?
Yeah.
What are you doing as a parent if your son thinks that is his role model?
He's a 25-year-old millionaire. He's going to be making some questionable decisions, right?
You know, and that's not to let, you know, the often, you know, grubby behaviour of you know, some of the people go by. You know, of course you can comment on it. Of course you can, you know, suggest that it's not the best way to be living life and everything, but you don't necessarily need to see them as role models. When it comes to people like Churchill and Nelson, there's aspects of them that you want to say, well, look, if we can emulate the courage, the determination in part, then that's probably a good thing for us to take forward.